Eric Clemons, Professor of Operations, Information and Decisions, Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. I've been there about forever, and I still love it.
And I'm John Seeley Brown, Chief of Confusion.
So in my life at different times, I've worked for the chairman of the London Stock Exchange. I knew no finance. I worked for the president of Lever. I knew nothing at the time about consumer packaged goods. And I forced myself, because these were, in my mind, two of the most important types of industries.
Right.
I forced myself, despite the terror, to put myself in a position where I was learning almost at an overwhelming speed. And you talk about doing that over and over and over for the rest of our lives. That requires courage. The alternative is to hide. Can you teach the courage and the optimism needed to get uncomfortable over and over and over again?
I think the catch is to understand the role of humility. I mean, in some sense, if you can approach these things from a humility point of view, then everything is a win-win situation. Because in fact, almost from a Buddhist sense, you are learning, yourself is becoming more full, and your inner self is what really matters. So if you look stupid for a moment in a more social in a broader context, what's the big deal? As long as you walk away with a deeper insight.
That ties back to what you said earlier about imagination. So I never presented myself to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as an expert. I came in with things that I saw as possible in an interconnected world, and I asked questions. And he asked me answers, and I said, I don't know, no one knows. Let's find out first. So what you're saying is it's a combination of joy, imagination, which I caught from the talk,
right,
and an overwhelming humility and willingness to learn.
Yeah, I think it's a third, an additional component. As you know from some of the work you've done, deep listening often involves as much listening to the white space, the silences, as what's being said. So out of an intelligence, the lack of a signal is often the main signal.
The dog that didn't bark.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, take that seriously, and how do you start to kind of develop the skills of deep listening, where then your imagination starts to close the gap and fill things in. So if you notice, we're talking about imagination as gap closing in terms of sense making, and you allow your mind the freedom to fill in that gap, to close that gap, with drawing on imagination that draws on past experiences, images of one form or another to help fill in the gap.
I think what I've found in your work fascinating over the decades I've known you is not just the gap filling, which is almost a form of engineering. What I find most interesting is the gap discovery, which is a profound form of imagination. And,
right.
I guess what you're saying is you discover the gaps in the deep silences.
You discover partially in the deep silences, but also, which is our book, and you talked to, I think, Anne briefly, really get driven home. We keep talking about sense making. The most interesting thing is sense breaking. What did Sherlock Holmes do brilliantly? Was he would, instead of close the gap, he would choose the right moment to open the gap, to expand the gap, that then causes you to reframe and then let your imagination fill it in.
He also knew how to throw out the signals that he was being fed, that the deliberate attempts or accidental attempts to confuse him. So if you switch to Dashiell Hammett and the Thin Man,
right.
If you find the remains of a body with a 40-inch belt, you might assume it was a very, very fat man who died. But it could also be a very thin murder victim with someone trying to conceal all of the details.
Yeah, so a bit sloppily, by the way, but yes.
So knowing what to throw out,
right,
can be just as important. Forgetting can be just as important as imagining.
Be almost as important, yes. The other catch is all this comes back to how do you read the context better. And, it's just, we never talk about reading context. Yet if you, play some of these games, you read context. If you're a surfer, you read context. If you're a skier, if you're a whitewater kayaker, you read context. If you're a basketball player, you read context galore. And so it's so ironic that in certain arenas, context is everything. In the academy, context does not get deified anything to the extent that it should.
In my classes, I try to teach the students to abstract down to the basic pattern by reading the context. So for instance, when I ask my students to judge to evaluate Uber Black as an investment, I wanted them to see it as Capital One, as finding the most profitable customers.
Right.
And there was an exam question to explain the progression from what's in your wallet to who's in your taxi. So we do need to try to teach that, but it's not what we're good at.
Right. Let me propose that a better word that you do, that characterizes what you do, is you curate experiences.
Absolutely.
Okay. Teaching does not have that property usually.
In fact, to the more formally trained academic, course material should not be dependent in any way on personal experience. And there's a degree of learning you just can't have without that. Can I switch gears and come back to something else that struck me? You're not just optimistic about yourself, you're compassionate about the planet. I remember when I was checking out a video at Park, and the video librarian, I had no idea that I knew you, but I got a lengthy discussion of what it used to be like when John Seely Brown was here. So compassion is absolutely essential. How do you teach compassion in an era of interconnected everything? How do you teach compassion when rolling out an app like Airbnb can make some people homeless? How do you deal with driverless cars when the largest employment opportunity in the US is actually driving transportation? How do you teach people to understand? How do you teach technologists to understand connectivity in their applications development?
Right. So, part of this is, how do you bring externalities that people are not used to thinking about to the fore? And I think that, again, it's kind of like, how do you immerse yourself in a context and then understand the ramifications of that context? So part of that immersion is to understand what are the boundaries. So it takes people a while, for example, with Airbnb, to begin to understand, as a single little event that seems so wonderful, when you have an entire community moves to Airbnb, like parts of this island, all of a sudden all you have is vacation rentals that the first night they come in throw parties all night long and you've destroyed the entire neighborhood. So, part of it is how do you immerse and then play out. And so it's a certain sense of going beyond your own personal interest, if you are the Airbnb holder, to think through the potential unintended consequences.
I agree, and we will come back to that, but the question was actually a little bit more focused. I have pointed out to some of my students or some executives the negative implications of some of the technologies, and I've been called, the nicest thing I've been called is a bleeping Luddite for actually arguing that there is downside as well as upside to technologies. Do you think that making people aware of the externalities is sufficient?
No.
Or is there something else we need to do?
No, I think, again, how do you embed people in the broader context enough to be able to have them experience some of these things, and to be aware. First of all, almost every tool, every technological tool has an upside and a downside, and so part of it is how do you play out what some of the downsides might hypothetically be. How do you think through the unintended consequences of those go exponential, and so on and so forth. And so, to me, it's been very sobering. Take the internet that I was obviously in the early days of, and take social media the same way. We did that to create a kind of freedom of expression that would give democracy a real chance to show its for. And now what do we see is just the opposite's happening. So it doesn't take too much imagination now to see, by God, a lot of these things have unintended consequences that build up because you didn't use enough imagination to see how things could be used against you as opposed to just for you.
Let's play with that and then come back to the externalities. In February of '09, I met Arianna Huffington, and we had an argument about the internet. And she was filled with optimism about the internet as a return to the agora, the golden age of democracy. And some little voice from my undergraduate classes shouted at me, and I said to her, the golden age of Pericles lasted 21 years.
Right.
He was sold out Athens was sold out by the serial trader Alcibiades. And what we had was the triumph of demagoguery over reason. I said the future of the net.
You mean yet again? No.
I said the future, paranoid yet again. And I said the future of democracy will be determined by the demagogue who's willing to push the boundaries of truth further. And how do you, if you see something like that, what I actually said to your partner earlier is that you constantly are a change agent because your imagination is linked with joy. I'm Cassandra because my imagination is constantly linked to deep terror. I would swap careers with you in a heartbeat, which is why I asked about whether the optimism could be taught. And let's come back to that. So if we play with externalities, we play with Airbnb. It's great for the guy with the property. It may be terrible for the guy who was thrown out, the previous tenant.
Or next door.
Or next door. In fact, if the guy with the apartment next to mine became Airbnb, and anybody on the street might end up with a key to the elevator to my floor, it wouldn't. I would start locking the door. I mean, it would change my life profoundly. How do you deal with that? Does that matter? Or is that just inevitable progress?
No, I mean, let's go back to your first question on the Huffington. The first thing I'd like to think about is we can talk about all the great sides, but then you might ask yourself, what are the rumble strips? What would be leading edge indicators that something may be headed the other direction? So it's one thing to say, this should open up democracy to the extreme. It's not too hard to speculate it could go bad as an act of imagination. And then the interesting question is, just like in scenario planning in some sense, what would be the leading edge indicators that this game may have just changed? And that's a beginning because of what I call rumble strips, on streets, on curves. There are certain ways to think this thing through. None of them can be complete by definition in complexity theory. And so in complexity theory, again, is an ontological shift to recognize that things have unintended consequences that often swamp the intended consequences. You can't take these things apart as mechanistic systems.
Now, you can't take them apart. You can't simplify. When we drive big 2-ton cars with 4-wheel drive, rumble strips are interesting. In a world that is cladistic, punctuated equilibria, hyper fast, as a motorcyclist, rumble strip on a wet road will have a very different impact for you than it will for me in a 2-ton car. And increasingly, we're all moving to motorcycles on a wet road.
Right.
How do we deal with that? How do you let the rumble strips be incorporated into your planning and not catastrophic?
Very simply by having a more balanced approach to this game. It's just like, if these technological advances that Chris I was referring to say we are redefining mankind in 5 years, that screams out now by different kind of world building, which is what Anne and I discuss a lot in our work, other work, and it screams out for how do you bring the humanist into play, how do you bring the artist into play, how do you bring the architect into play, how do you bring the film. One of the reasons I work as much in the School of Cinema at USC as any place else. It's kind of how do you use these new tools to, construct a much more textured understanding of how things could go wrong and what they really are about.
Perfect. To come back to how things can go wrong, the internet has led to a market for everything. There's a market clearing price for everything. Surge pricing on Uber Black is allocative efficiency.
Right.
It ensures that the guy who wants the car the most gets it. And as an economist, we agree that's wonderful stuff. Allocative efficiency would also support online markets for organ transplants, which is clearly problematic. So we've got efficiency versus fairness trade-offs over and over and over again. Is that an inevitable challenge to society, or will we figure out how to balance efficiency and fairness?
Well, you may call it fairness, I call it ethics. And the whole question is, which is coming up more and more now, is how does one start to bring ethical considerations to the forefront? And, we need to, this sense of these silos that our academy turns out is increasingly problematic. That we don't really understand how to bring the practice of practices together, and some of those would be, how do you start to play out the downsides of some of this? What are the ethical, philosophic, humanistic consequences of some of this? And so we just have to radically open up the conversation.
You're making us go holistic, not just in the closed system of the corporation.
No.
Not just the closed system of the app and its users. We need to go holistic in terms of the implications for the planet in ways we never did before. Now, what we do with that is a combination of ethics or fairness, but you can't even bring those discussions to the forefront until you can think that way.
Right. And if you look at this thing as technological determinism or deterministic systems, it's very hard to weave this in. If you begin to realize that we're moving into a world in which everything is a set of complex, ecological exchanges and complex ecology, and you can look at those through multiple lenses, then we'll begin to kind of change the conversation.
Before I would get into statistical mechanics or quantum mechanics, when I try to teach holistic thinking, I find it useful to have someone who's got a training in physics or in computer simulation or agent-based modeling, where at least you understand the interaction of the parts. You start there. Then you make the system larger, still deterministic. Then you make the leap to statistical mechanics, deterministic over large numbers. And then you go to quantum mechanics, where the mere process of experimentation changes the system. So that's, as a physicist, that's how I would teach holistic thinking. My students don't have the patience for that. Do your clients have the patience for that? Have you found a way to do that?
I never approach it that way. What you're really doing is layering on one deterministic system on top of the other.
Till I break from determinism.
Right, but that, right. And then the way you break determinism is still within the field of quantitative work. I think if we actually go back to Gregory Bateson and start with understanding how ecologies work as sets of exchanges, and what are autonomous, or what are what kind of mutual autocratic mutualism is embedded in these, can be embedded in these systems, and so on. We start to build a whole new language, and these things become surprisingly observable, and it doesn't take too much imagination to see how we can start to kind of trace out the changes of influence, circles of influence that we're talking about, and so on. So I think that this is going to be much more tractable, approaching it kind of starting from a humanistic point of view, or even not a macro or microeconomic point of view, but as sets of ensembles of exchanges.
Okay, so we don't have to start with ontogeny, recapitulates, phylogeny, and I don't have to teach integrative thinking.
Only if you really want to bore people.
No, the way I figured it out.
Right.
What you're saying is we can use the language of someone, for example, like Jay Forrester. We can start with interconnected stochastic feedback loops and teach holistic thinking by allowing people to create larger and larger, more and more realistic interacting models.
Right. So the other thing I would think about doing, I don't think she's gone off right now, but you may want to do a quick here, is grab Anne and do an interview with her. She knows more about how to rewire students' brains than almost anybody I've met through what happens in her design studios. And how do you start to shift from design to designing for emergence? And what happens when you get students to thinking about designing for emergence and having them be able to play in those types of systems? After about 3 months, their brains have been rewired.
If I'm very lucky, I will have an opportunity to do that at length. But what I'd like to do is ask one last question, because you brought up something that was very powerful at the end of the talk, and that was the algorithm made me do it. And sometimes I can write an algorithm with a specific wicked intent, different sense of the word wicked. Sometimes I can let the algorithm rediscover illegal behavior without ever programming it in, and I have algorithms that do wicked things. And sometimes if we all have the same algorithm, we end up with flash crashes or the stock exchange crash of '87. So when we all moved slowly, manually, we could see what we were doing, and we codified what we were doing. Regulators could see what we were doing. When we develop algorithms through machine learning, we all develop the same algorithms. They may be wicked, they may be immoral, and they may be fantastically unstable. How do we deal with that?
I think one of the biggest challenges we have right now is to completely rethink how we teach and think about public policy. Public policy is built for deterministic systems with long time constants. And yet, nothing we do today really can work without certain types of regulations, even in terms of the tragedy of the commons, how that actually works.
I couldn't have asked a more self-serving question, since I'm putting together an international group to study information, society, and public policy, and I was going to ask you to chair it.
No, but you can ask Anne to chair it.
All right.
Yes.
Last question, because I think it's a fitting way to end. Are you still as optimistic as you were 20 years ago?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me if I still was optimistic having met you this afternoon again.
I'm hoping my paranoia is no longer contagious.
Well, paranoia is useful, by the way. It's only because it really pays to understand how people resonate negatively as well as they resonate positively. Both can be, both are dangerous if not understood.
I was discussing that with Anne earlier.
Oh, okay.
And she said something, in essence, she said, okay, you can come at this integrative, holistic approach the way John does through joy, or the way you do through sheer terror, and both would work. But are you still as optimistic as you were 20 years ago?
I'm more excited now than I ever have been.
So am I. Great.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Sure.
Thank you.